thinks it'd be smarter to like pretend that he can interpret these doodles too.
So all the other rhetoric is fine, but I'm going to point one thing out. Joseph Smith was not pretending that he could translate these things. That does not mean he could, but he sincerely thought he could. And we actually know exactly where he got his purported translation of the Kinderhook plates from. One of the Kinderhook plates features prominently near the top a figure that looks like a little boat. Now, Joseph Smith obviously looked at that and said, hey, I recognize that figure, and went to his Egyptian alphabet and found another character that looks like a little boat. And he called that character Ho'eupha. And the description of that character in his Egyptian alphabet happens to represent a very close paraphrase of what Clayton reported him to provide as his initial translation of the Kinderhook plate. So he obviously thought he was working with these revealed truths. None of it has anything to do with the ancient world, but let's keep it honest.
You see what that is? You see?
All right, man, if you're really saying you think those counties are all voting Democrat because they're the racist white descendants of the owners of those enormous plantations, then how do you explain the fact that the green on this map highlights the higher concentrations of black populations in those areas? These are the descendants of all those slaves that those plantations had to bring in because they were the largest plantations in the country. And they have been stuck in these areas for the most part ever since, because of all the different kinds of systemic racism that traps them there and that traps them in poverty and that keeps them from moving away. You have not done any research, dude. Party realignment is just an indisputable historical fact, and you need to research beyond the reach of your confirmation bias. So I've been asked to respond to a Trinitarian reading of John 1:1, and basically I don't think it works unless you can demonstrate two things that I've never seen demonstrated. One, that there was a widespread understanding of strict philosophical monotheism in first century Judaism and or Christianity, meaning there was a belief in one deity alone. All other existence was clearly delineated from that deity, and there was nothing that crossed that boundary. Two, you have to be able to demonstrate that there was a widespread philosophical notion of multiple persons existing within the one essence or being of God. Now, that philosophical framework is a 3rd or 4th century innovation. So I've never seen anyone even attempt to show that that existed anywhere in 1st century Jewish and or Christian texts. If you want further thoughts from me on this, I published a paper in the journal Biblical Interpretation on my thoughts. It's entitled Cognitive Perspectives on Early Christology. If you Google that title, you can find access. Hey, Zentropy7, I thought I'd give you a little time to respond to my comment. Doesn't seem like any response is forthcoming, so I thought I'd go look up the text that you found on Google Images that you figured would make your case, and so it is part of the south wall of a passageway towards the threshold of Akhet in the pyramid text of Unis. It mentions Horus 3 times in the text, but never in any way even remotely related to any of the mythicist theories that you are promoted. The very first line talks about this is the eye of Horus, and then about halfway down you have a reference to blue-eyed Horus coming against the gods. Beware of red-eyed Horus. Nothing else anywhere in that text has anything whatsoever to do with any of the mythicist frameworks that you have asserted. So it seems like you need to do a lot better research. Hey, thanks for the invitation and for the thoughtful response. I'll start out by saying one of my areas of specialization is cognitive linguistics. And so I spent a lot of time researching and writing about how and why words, phrases, and clauses mean what people understand them to mean. And one of the conclusions that is a consensus within my field is that texts don't have any inherent meaning. And so no text means anything whatsoever apart from a reader or a readership. And so I would consider the notion to be a non-starter that the scripture says something independent of the context of a reader or a readership. And this is one of the reasons I don't think the text can mean something years, centuries, millennia before anyone ever read it to mean that thing. The other thing I would say is that I'm not a huge fan of dictionary semantics, of definitions, and I've made videos about this before, but using necessary and sufficient features to try and delineate a conceptual category is a distortion of how conceptual categories are formed, learned, and used. So if you want to define terms, I'd like to know which terms precisely you want to define. I've published on this elsewhere, so I have pretty strong feelings about this as well, because definitions primarily, in my experience in public discourse, are primarily about structuring power and values, and in debates they're primarily about trying to draw hard lines around concepts so that one person's understanding takes priority over another, and that's just not how language works. So I have pretty strong feelings about that too. But let me know what terms you want to define and how you understand them, and let's see where we can go from there. Hey, thanks for your response. I appreciate it. I would say two things before we move on. One, authorial intent absolutely is relevant, but it's only relevant to the degree we can actually debate it. Saying that God wrote it and I have X, Y, or Z belief about God's intent is not something that we can debate. That's a theological dogma. And so there's no debate. There's just a question. Do you accept my theological dogma or not? And so I don't think it's worth debating something that's really just going to come down to, do you accept what I'm saying or not? And so I think the debate has to continue on the level of being able to interrogate authorial intent. And so if the author or authors of the Gospel of John intended it to mean what you're suggesting it means, one, it had to come from somewhere, and two, there had to be other people who shared that understanding, otherwise it would have no significance. There's not really, we can't really demonstrate that anyone published something that became popular even though people had no idea what they were talking about, and that the true meaning was only revealed later on. That's just not how language works. The other thing I would say is that personification was a big deal in the ancient world. Different qualities of God are discussed at length as if they were independent agents or semi-independent agents. And so the whole question, when it comes time to explain how that can work, so that's a reflective rationalization. It's one, we can come up with these ideas, but at some point somebody's going to say, hey, explain that. And that's when we have to create these conceptual frameworks on which to clothe these concepts. And so that was the whole debate in early Christianity, is how do we explain this intimate, close relationship between the Son and the Father? And early Christianity went through a variety of iterations that they didn't like before it took a social institution to actually say, pick one, do it now, that's what we're sticking with. And that's when they adopted the concept of homoousios, which was actually a Gnostic doctrine of emanation that Christianity had addressed in the 2nd and 3rd century, but always to reject it. So what happened in the 4th century is they finally said, this is the framework that we are going to use to rationalize, to explain, to make philosophically defensible what we think is going on with the relationship of Jesus to God. And in the New Testament, they're doing the same rationalizations. And I discussed this in the article that I mentioned previously, Cognitive Perspectives on Early Christology. So if you'd like my further thoughts on that, you can find it there. So, hope to hear from you soon.
Book of Mormon talking about animals and things that weren't even to America, so I don't understand why you're saying what.
So that video doesn't address in any way, shape, or form any truth claims of the church, any theological dogmas, or any claims to prophetic ability whatsoever. I pretty explicitly state that none of the texts I mentioned have anything to do with the ancient world, and that all I was doing in that video was pointing out that the historical evidence does not support the claim that Joseph Smith knew the Kinderhook plates were fake, but decided to intentionally lie about trying to translate them. That's the only point I'm trying to make in that video. And I don't think that's a particularly difficult point to understand. Hey everybody, I wanted to talk briefly about the documentary hypothesis and try to clear the air regarding some misunderstandings that I've heard over the last several years, including in some graduate programs that I've been in. And one sticks out to me, and that was my second master's degree. There was a gentleman who's become a good friend of mine who came in from an MDiv, who within a few weeks of the start of the semester was kind of surprised and said, I had heard that we had rejected the documentary hypothesis and had gone back to Mosaic authorship. And that's a big misrepresentation of what's going on, because the methodological foundation of source criticism is as strong as ever. And we've examined a lot of known composite texts to find out exactly what kinds of features tend to crop up at literary seams, and then we've gone and found those same features in the Pentateuch precisely at the place where the main literary seams have been posited. And when we get down into verse 3a alpha, is one source, and 3a beta is another, that might be going a little beyond the data. But the methodological foundation is strong and is being strengthened. But the criticisms that are arising with the documentary hypothesis primarily have to do with how some of the sources have been characterized. Everybody hopefully has heard of JEDP, the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly source. And what the main target of a lot of this criticism is are the J and E sources, which some scholars, primarily German and continental European scholars, have been arguing over the last 15 years or so, that these don't constitute full documentary sources the same way that the other two do. That these are fragmentary, small stories, collections of stories that are pretty much limited to Genesis and then some of the seams that tie Exodus to Genesis that were later additions. And so they're not saying throw out source criticism. They're saying J and E shouldn't really be considered full sources. We should be talking about the Deuteronomist, the priestly source, and then pre-P and post-P sources and redactions and editors and things like that. And I actually think there's a lot to what they're saying. I think the arguments are pretty strong. So source criticism is still very much the consensus in the scholarship, and I'll be happy to post the names of some publications that represent this discussion going back and forth. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and see you around.
Joseph Smith thought he could translate those plates, and obviously he couldn't.
Hey, so if you go check out the original video, you'll see I explain in detail where Joseph Smith got this translation from, why that was all he was able to come up with. And I am LDS, but my membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not based on faith in Joseph Smith. Nor am I here on TikTok to defend my membership or to question or attack anyone else's faith. I'm here for purely academic reasons, and my interest in anything related to Mormonism on TikTok is from a purely academic, critical point of view, and that's how I intend to engage it. I hope that's not an inconvenience. Morning, thanks for the video. There was one video I believe I didn't respond to because you said in it that you were going to do some research, do some reading. I wanted to give you an opportunity to do that just so we didn't have multiple videos that we had to go and respond to at the same time. Okay, first, I think you're talking about Tertullian, born in the mid-2nd century CE. He was the first person to use the word Trinity, but what he promoted, I don't think is what you want to call the Trinity, because he said that the Son was a created being, that the Son was subordinate to the Father, and that the Son was a second God. So this is one of those examples of trying to philosophically rationalize the relationship of God to his Son, and this was one of those unsuccessful attempts. That it wasn't clarified until late 3rd, early 4th century CE. And you talk about monotheism. Monotheism is a lot more complex than belief in one God, because it's not just the belief that one God matters. It's the belief that only one God exists, and that everything apart from that person or being of that one God is not divine or is not a deity. That concept is a 18th, 19th century innovation. The word does not exist anywhere until around 1680 when Henry Moore coined it. And so worshiping one God is not monotheism. Believing only one God matters is not monotheism. Believing only one God is powerful is not monotheism. So there's a big debate about this in the scholarship when anything we might call monotheism actually exists. I'm a participant in this debate, and so I'm going to need a lot more than just saying, well, everybody was a monotheist. That is far from the case. Third, spirit as a personified aspect of deity. There were a number of personified aspects of deity, as well as agents that were perceived to be both distinct from God and also God. The angel of the Lord is probably the clearest one, where people engage with either the angel, either God, or it goes back and forth. 1 second they're the angel, 1 second they're God. This also happens to some degree with Chokhmah. The spirit's kind of distinction and personification is a product of the literature of the Greco-Roman period, Jewish literature of the Greco-Roman period. Now that's not canon, but it was absolutely indisputably influential. So the Enochic literature, a lot of the pseudepigrapha, that kind of stuff is where the spirit really starts to take on a distinct personality and become a separate agent from God. In the Hebrew Bible, it is not quite as clear, but it's still there. For instance, the spirit forcing entry into Saul and turning him into another person and all this kind of stuff. A lot of this is explained in the article that I mentioned that I wrote. I think I linked directly to the PDF, but if you have a chance to read that article, I think there's going to be a lot of questions we can avoid because it's explained therein.